Thank you. I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me to speak here about real-world evidence in clinical trials, and it's a topic that I'm very interested in. This is my background and disclosures. Here's an overview of what I'll be covering today. First, unlike randomized controlled trials, the patients, the methods, the outcomes are not standardized in real-world evidence trials. So these trials can suggest hypotheses, but not prove hypotheses. Real-world evidence trials are less costly than randomized controlled trials. They're useful for showing real-world side effects and costs of comparative treatments, and they can be used to support regulatory and payer submissions, but it's my position that they do not replace randomized controlled trials. This outline shows 5 topics that I will be addressing today. First, what is real-world evidence? Second, how does real-world evidence differ from randomized controlled trial evidence? Third, can a real-world evidence trial generate similar results as a randomized controlled trial and therefore also save money and identify rare outcomes? Fourth, how does the U.S. FDA view real-world evidence? Finally, will real-world evidence trials replace randomized controlled trials? So my first question is, what is real-world evidence? So here's a definition that I made. A real-world evidence trial is a study of a treatment using data from observations of patients during routine clinical practice. This is called real-world data, rather than the data that we may be used to collecting from a randomized controlled trial. So the patient is just living their life, and we make observations by obtaining different types of data about the patient without the patient even realizing it. There's various sources of data that can be used to collect for real-world evidence trials. This slide shows some examples. Starting at 9 o'clock and going clockwise, people can use disease registries, consumer data, wearables, pharmaceutical adverse outcome data, lab studies and biomarker studies, mortality data, social media data, pharmacy claims, hospital data, insurance claims, survey data, and the one that's used most often is data from the electronic health record. So in every one of these cases, the patient is not told to submit data. The data is generated, and then you go back later and you look at it. So how does real-world evidence differ from randomized controlled trial data, RWE, real-world evidence, compared to RCT, randomized controlled trial? Well, if you look at a randomized controlled trial as a source of data, there's 3 things you could say about a randomized controlled trial. This is an experiment where subjects are randomly allocated to receive either the intervention or standard care. There's random allocation, and that is because subjects who are more or less likely to benefit from this intervention are distributed equally into both groups. It's really important to try to put patients who have some reason why you think they're going to do well with certain treatment and divide them into the 2 groups, so you don't find out later that the reason one group did better was because of this factor that was inherent in the group that received the treatment arm. So randomized controlled trial is recognized as the gold standard study to assess the efficacy of an intervention. And efficacy means it works under ideal circumstances as opposed to effectiveness, which means it works in the real world. There's some disadvantages of randomized controlled trials. Much as we like them, they tend to be expensive. Anyone who's been an investigator in a randomized controlled trial knows how much work there is to set it up and to monitor it and to analyze the data. Randomized controlled trials are expensive. We know that it takes a long time to recruit the right patients who meet the inclusion and exclusion criteria. And generally, the intervention is compared against a placebo or a limited number of alternative treatments. In some cases, clinicians have noted that the eligibility criteria can be unrealistic. It might be that you document that a certain treatment works in a certain type of patient, but there are a lot of other types of patients out there that were not in this protocol. Also, it turns out that some groups can be underrepresented. You're just looking at a select group of patients. You're not looking at the whole world. Finally, there's something called a trial effect or Hawthorne effect, and this can inflate the apparent benefit of the intervention. So RCTs have their advantages and disadvantages. Now, one could say the opposite of a randomized controlled trial is a pragmatic real-world evidence trial. Pragmatic in this case means at least you're starting prospectively with a group and then seeing what happens in the future. You could also do an observational real-world evidence trial where you're doing everything in the future and it's essentially a chart review. So in a real-world evidence trial that's pragmatic, the intervention is applied to all types of patients and by all types of clinicians. There's not any restriction on how the intervention is used. Often in a randomized controlled trial, we're told that people have to have a certain A1C level. They can't have a history of a certain problem. In a real-world evidence trial, anybody can use the treatment. Anybody can prescribe it. They can prescribe it any way they want. The comparator treatment there is usual care. You're getting the treatment or you're not getting the treatment. There's no formal follow-up where they have a final visit and everything is measured at that point. You just arbitrarily say at a certain time point, we stop the study. There's no steps in the real world to promote adherence as there are in randomized controlled trials. Many randomized controlled trials, the study coordinator will phone the patient every few weeks, ask how they're doing. They'll count pills, they'll count strips. They'll do a lot to make sure that the intervention is being administered in the maximum way. A real-world evidence trial, it may be that this treatment is difficult to adhere to and people aren't even using it very much. That's the real world. And finally, the data is analyzed for all participants, known as intention to treat. So this is how a real-world evidence trial works. You're putting a lot less effort into it at every step, and it costs less. There's some advantages to real-world evidence. First, this type of study generates outcome data that reflects how the intervention is actually used in the real world. It's not just people with an A1C of 6 to 7.5, and you're thinking, well, those people are very special. They're controlled better than most. It would be for any patient. So that's the real world. Also, it's possible with the real-world evidence to obtain economic cost-benefit data. You know how much is being spent on the patient, and you assign a cost to certain outcomes. And you can have very large numbers of patients because each patient doesn't cost you much. So you can get pretty accurate economic data from a real-world evidence trial. They're also useful for looking at long-term safety. Typically, a randomized controlled trial looks at hundreds or in some cases thousands of patients, and a very rare side effect might not turn up. But in a real-world evidence study, you can look at tens of thousands of patients, and if there's a rare side effect, it's more likely to show up in such a large pool of patients. So I say that a real-world evidence trial is useful to identify rare, unanticipated complications. Now, one can think of clinical trials as being on a spectrum. This group from England wrote a paper in 2015 called the PRECIS tool, which allows you to take the features of a trial, map them out against the metric they created, and decide whether your tool is at one end of the spectrum, which they call an explanatory randomized controlled trial, or whether it's the other end of the spectrum, and then it's known as a pragmatic real-world evidence trial. If it's a randomized controlled trial, then that means that in red, the intervention works under ideal conditions. You're comparing it with one of multiple interventions that are defined, and you can use this to test the hypothesis, such as, does this treatment actually work in this situation? A real-world evidence trial in blue, it says, does this intervention work under usual conditions, just however it's prescribed? You're comparing it with usual care, and if you see a benefit, you haven't proven anything, but you've generated a hypothesis that it might work. So the way I look at this is, it would be nice to do a randomized controlled trial on everything we do, but it's expensive and takes time. So the challenge of doing a real-world evidence trial is to do something that will resemble a randomized controlled trial, but for less money. And when you think about what you're comparing, a randomized controlled trial compares the advantages and disadvantages of a new treatment against those of an old treatment. But it uses the same types of subjects, the same treatment for each cohort. You have the same adherence, which is good for the treatments, and use the same metrics for assessing outcomes. On the other hand, a real-world evidence trial, it compares the advantages and disadvantages, but instead of the same types of subjects, they're extremely similar, but you're not actually controlling, and they're not going to be the same. Is it the same treatment? It's similar, but you're not telling the investigator exactly how to administer it. Is it adherence? You figure it's similar, but you're not telling the patient to be adherent. And are you going to have similar metrics? Well, it turns out different hospitals use different codes, sometimes because they get paid better for certain codes, and sometimes you're not sure whether the diagnosis you want is being used for the same code from one hospital and another, or one clinic and another. For that reason, there's some problematic real-world trial designs that you have to watch out for. One is selection bias, where one group of patients is selected that just inherently is more likely to benefit. I saw a study that was submitted to our journal recently where they showed that people using insulin pumps had better outcomes than people who weren't using insulin pumps in a real-world evidence trial. And it turned out that the pump users were almost all using CGM. The non-pump users were almost all not using CGM. So that would be known as selection bias. There can be investigator bias, where it may turn out that some investigators are familiar with using the intervention, some aren't. There's adherence bias, where sometimes certain groups are using the treatment and others aren't, so the benefit is not the treatment, but it's using the treatment. And there's reporting bias, where you don't report outcomes the same way in different situations. And then there's one other barrier to what I call the believability of real-world evidence studies. Multiple retrospective real-world analyses and electronic data sets can be conducted with varying study designs, which means you crank out the data over and over again until the desired result is obtained and then published as if it was the result of a single study with a pre-specified protocol. This is why we have clinicaltrials.gov. What you shouldn't do is say, for example, let's see whether a well-designed real-world evidence study showed that in 2019, CGM users had better outcomes than non-CGM users. And you look at your population, and it was really about the same. So you say, okay, let's look at 2018. It was about the same. Now you look at 2017. Now that year, CGM patients did much better. So you write a report, you say, well, we have real-world evidence that CGM patients do better because when we looked at 2017, they had a much better outcome. And that's sort of cooking the data, and that can happen if a real-world evidence study is not pre-specified and reported to clinicaltrials.gov. How does the FDA view real-world evidence? I wrote this editorial last year that the FDA now has a program to support development of drugs and biologics. In 2016, U.S. Congress passed the 21st Century Cures Act, which specified that the FDA has to start using real-world evidence in its decisions. in 2017, FDA announced that they would be using real-world evidence to support decision-making for devices. Then in 2018, FDA announced the strategic program to use real-world evidence for drugs and biologics. And starting in 2016, the FDA has written dozens of articles praising the potential benefits of real-world evidence, especially in drugs and biologics. So FDA is on board. I wrote this editorial last year with Alberto Gutierrez, Zan Fleming, and David Kerr about how real-world evidence should be used in regulatory decisions. And a team at Harvard picked up on this type of approach and wrote up 5 situations where real-world evidence can be used by the FDA. First, for primary approval. For most products, not. But if you have a very rare condition and it's going to be really difficult to recruit people and try to randomize them, you can say we'll build sort of a model population for the ones that are on no intervention, so then you don't have to recruit as many people. Or if the disease is so fatal, like cancer, that nobody would volunteer to receive placebo. So occasionally it can be used. In diabetes, it's almost never used for approving a drug or a device. But for secondary indication, and number 2, after you have initial approval, you can collect some real-world evidence and get approval for secondary indication. Another approach can be used, more so in Europe than the US, but can be used in both, is you get initial approval, but after the approval, you know that there's this pre-specification to collect some real-world evidence, and then if that looks good, you get the full approval. Fourth one is safety. In some cases, FDA would be concerned that the drug is not safe, so they'll give you the approval, but immediately after the approval, they require that some real-world evidence be done to go along with the approval. And the last situation is a product gets approved, and then down the road, unexpectedly, a safety signal comes up, and then the FDA comes back to the manufacturer and says, okay, now you've got to do a real-world evidence safety study. This is an article that came out a few weeks ago, and it shows the Commissioner of the Food and Drug Administration, Stephen Hahn, addressing FDA staffers, explaining how he wants to do more with real-world evidence. So as recently as January, FDA is on board with using real-world evidence. The last question I raise is, will real-world evidence trials replace randomized controlled trials? This is a study in JAMA where they looked at randomized controlled trials. They found that only 15% of them explained what they were doing well enough that you could build a model population to compare it. A lot of randomized controlled trials are opaque, and so it's difficult to do a comparison. This is a study done by a group at Harvard, and they found that only 4% of randomized controlled studies reported enough information that you could build a model study for comparison. But they did an interesting study. One of the big cardiovascular outcome studies is known as Carolina, and this group at Harvard, in the blue box on top, did a real-world evidence comparison of linagliptin compared to glimepiride. And what they showed in the green box in the upper right corner is that linagliptin has a non-inferior risk of a composite cardiovascular outcome compared to glimepiride. When the actual randomized controlled trial was reported 9 months later, they had similar results, a hazard ratio of 0.91 in the real-world evidence, 0.98 in the randomized controlled trial. So the Harvard group said this shows that you can build in silico population that will be similar to a real-world evidence trial. But as you could imagine, some people said this is evidence in favor of using real-world evidence trials, and other people said the results weren't the same, they got lucky, don't do this again. But this group has a contract with FDA, and they're going to review 30 studies and see if they can get similar results using real-world evidence. So my feeling about clinical trials is that a clinical trial can assist an investigator to predict the future by comparing outcomes from known starting point data. But here's where I see a lot of bad real-world evidence studies. A proper real-world evidence clinical trial is not the same as an uncontrolled data stream. We get a lot of articles, and I read a lot of articles of real-world evidence. Sometimes they submit to Journal of Diabetes Science Technology. And I'm going to show you an example of a conclusion. The author, I think, is in this room, but I've scrubbed it, so nobody's going to know who it is. But this is a real-world evidence conclusion. This real-world evidence study is the first study to explore X therapy and suggest that X may be effective. These results should be expanded upon via controlled studies. It's an uncontrolled study. I say, you look at this, why bother? Maybe this will be a letter to the editor, but it's not a real study. Don't submit junk and then call it real-world evidence. Real-world evidence has true features. So my conclusions are that new data sources can allow real-world evidence trials to differentiate themselves from randomized controlled trials. Real-world evidence trials of treatments require care to avoid introducing bias into the treatment arm. The FDA is supporting the use of real-world evidence for trial design and some prospective research. And finally, for now, real-world evidence can supplement but not yet replace randomized controlled trials for regulatory use. Thank you.